Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Crypto Hipsters podcast, where I interview founders and co-founders, entrepreneurs and artists, executives and stay-at-home hipsters in crypto and blockchain around the world. And I have an amazing podcast for you today. Let's get to it.
I am delighted today to introduce a special guest, Jonny Fry, who is the Chief Executive Officer at TeamBlockchain. Welcome, Jonny, to the show.
Thanks, Jamil. Nice to be on the show, and thanks for inviting me.
You're very welcome. So we'll kick things off, and I'll first ask you, what is your background, and how does it relate to what you do now at TeamBlockchain?
Okay, so most of my working life, I've actually been involved in the financial services sector, managing mutual funds. I set up a mutual fund company literally from my bedroom back in the late 80s, and then went on and floated that company on the London Stock Exchange. Company was called Premier Asset Management, and it still trades today as Premier Miton. But it's managing pension funds, mutual funds, for individuals and corporations. So I've always been involved in the regulated space. I'm still actually chairman of a fund administration business based out of Dublin, a company called Gemini Capital Management, and that does the administration for about 10 different fund managers from the States, Europe, Asia, Australia. So we're doing the compliance administration, so still very much involved in the fund management scene. And it was looking at how blockchain technology could try and make the financial service sector a little bit more efficient, because there's lots and lots of layers, intermediaries when you're managing someone's funds. And I was very interested how you could actually use the technology and indeed create digital versions of these funds to actually reduce the costs and make it much, much more transparent. So that was kind of how I got involved in this sector, and that's why we treat what we do and the analysis that we create as if it's a compliant document. So we verify all the information with hyperlinks and referencing what we do as if we were regulated, but TeamBlockchain itself isn't regulated as a company.
Okay, great. So one of the things that you do at TeamBlockchain is you create a weekly report called Digital Bytes.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
And what inspired you to create and maintain Digital Bytes?
Well, literally 3 years ago in March, we've been asked to do some research and some work for a large firm of lawyers. And at the end of the meeting with their client, they actually said, well, how do you remember all these statistics that you were quoting? And we said, well, we write it down. And they said, well, can we see your notes? And we showed them our laptop, and they said, why have you got these blue words and some of the rest in black? And we said, well, the blue is all hyperlinked. And they said, why hyperlink things? And we said, well, simply because if your client comes back to you, you've just paid us for our time because you wanted us to present to your client and give them independent information. If they turn around and say, well, how do you know, PayPal is nearly 3 times the size of Goldman Sachs? Well, we can point to an article in the Wall Street Journal or CNBC or some independent publication to prove that. And they said, oh, that's really helpful. Can we have a copy? And we said, well, yeah, you can have a copy of this. And they said, well, what else have you got? And we showed them. They said, can we have a copy of that? And we said, no, you've got to pay for it. And they said, well, how often do you do it? And I said, well, we basically do this once a week. And they said, well, can we have a copy on a weekly basis of your analysis of what you're doing? And that sort of led us to the thought, well, why don't we actually sort of commercialize this and start offering it out to accountants, lawyers, corporate brokers, business schools, universities, organizations, to say, well, look, what's going on in the blockchain and digital asset sectors? So how, why, and where is the technology and these assets being used? But what it's not meant to be, it's not meant to be a newsletter, and it's not meant to be promoting any particular service or product. It's meant to be sort of thought-provoking analysis. And the ideas come from, years in sort of, getting sort of analysis on funds or equities. And we were trying to recreate the same thing, but give you a sort of a 15-minute, once a week overview of some of the things that are happening on a global basis. So we look at things happening in Paris, maybe in Korea, maybe in Japan, maybe in the States, and in different sectors. So it's financial services, it may be the entertainment industry, maybe media, fashion, retail. So we're trying to really show this is what your competitors are doing. Are you ready? And what would you do? And how, if people start asking you questions about what's going on in the marketplace, you've got some concrete examples. And then what happens is that people actually then subscribe to that, to have a license to use the content, and then they repurpose it and send it on to their clients, either on a weekly or a monthly basis, or they use some of the articles for LinkedIn postings or social messaging, social media sites and things like that. So they've got independent analysis that they can then send to their clients and staff.
It's one of the things that people don't realize is how global, blockchain technology
Oh, it's
is.
incredibly good, and how quickly it's changing. This takes about 20 hours a week to produce. So 20 hours a week, we're looking at all sorts of articles. That's on. It's nearly all web based now because most of the publications on the web, and looking at sort of how and where and examples of what's actually happening in different jurisdictions and different industries. And that's it's amazing how much it. When we first started doing it 3 years ago, I thought we're never going to find enough once a week to write about it. But we do about 4,000 words a week, and I reckon we could probably do easily 8,000 and still only be touching a tiny fraction of what's going on.
Yeah, it's amazing. One of the things that I found interesting about you, your background, and one of the videos that you did talked about is when I first entered blockchain, which was in 2017. I very quickly got involved in a loyalty project, and we didn't succeed. But the loyalty rewards points as an industry right now in traditional finance is over $200 billion industry.
Yeah.
So, what's your take on the current loyalty rewards points industry, and then the sustainability potential of a crypto entry into the sector? Now, please take into account there have been several efforts, including one I was on in the last few years, that have failed, meaning it sounds like a logical and easy space for crypto to enter the space, but the practical adoption and operational viability is a very different story. So how do you see the entry, and how do you see widespread adoption playing out?
Okay, so I think what was very significant was last year when you saw JP Morgan, biggest bank in the world outside of China, and they actually started getting involved in the loyalty market because they saw that the American Airlines loyalty scheme was worth more than the equity of American Airlines. That's kind of crazy when you think about it. The loyalty scheme worth more than the airline that's actually been given out these loyalty schemes. And therefore, I think what we're going to see is, look, loyalty schemes have been around for many, many years, and they rely on an economic principle called nudge economics. So all of your listeners will be exposed to this because those that go in a car, they have a seatbelt. So they're nudged to put their seatbelt on so that actually it's safer when they're driving. Most people in most countries, they don't have one refuge bin, one dustbin. They have 2 or 3, one for garbage and trash, one for recycling. So they're being nudged, encouraged to change their behavior. And in the same way with loyalty schemes, what we've seen to date is big corporations arguably have fought shy of loyalty schemes because they've got your data, they've got your information for free. And if you look at the FANGs, the Facebook, Apple's, Alphabet, iGoogle, those sorts of companies, they've got your information, your buying habits, and they haven't had to pay for it. And now what we're seeing is more and more, and I believe this is one of the key things that we're going to see, certainly with digital assets, is that it's going to enable individuals to start monetizing their data. So whether it's your spending habits, whether it's your car journeys, your travel journeys, whether it's the homes and the offices that you live and work in, all of that is producing data. And people want that data because then it helps them to run more efficient businesses. And so I think that what we're going to see, despite some of the efforts and companies that have failed in this sector, I see that rewarding people via loyalty schemes, via encouragement through nudge economics is going to be a very, very powerful tool. And it could well signal the increase in terms of the power for the individuals over their data and a decrease from, some of the big tech companies that we've seen to date, who basically have hoovered up all your data, and most people haven't realized it. Now, to give you a practical example, SC Johnson, very successful US company, the people that make Glade air fresheners, cherry blossom boot polish, they actually wanted to do something for society. They wanted to actually do something about the millions of plastic bottles and pollution that arguably some of their products had made. So they set up a scheme in conjunction with a company called Plastic Bank. And this is a charity. And they said, look, what we want to do is encourage people to pick up and recycle plastic. And Plastic Bank said, well, that's what we do. We just need some money. So the way it originally started off is that, they were just being given individuals, young children and typically non-working ladies were given money for, bags of plastic. What they realized is that money wasn't always being used in perhaps the ways that SC Johnson had necessarily intended, because maybe dad came home, gave the kids a flick around the ear and went back down the local bar. So they said, well, most of these people seem to have phones. Why don't we give them some sort of digital sort of reward, some sort of like an air mile? And for your older listeners here in the UK, maybe a Green Shield stamp. And for some people that sort of, go to Starbucks and other coffee houses, like, you get a bit of paper and then they literally stamp on there and say, okay, on your 10th coffee, you get a free coffee. Well, so what they started doing was actually giving people these loyalty points, these credits, which then could be swapped for food, pharmaceutical drugs, clothes, books, that sort of thing. So what they've done is managed now to recycle and pick up 8,000 tons of plastic in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, Egypt, and recycling that plastic. And they've encouraged local people in their communities to clean up their villages, clean up their beaches. So it's a real win-win. And because of that, they can also say, SC Johnson, that is, their shareholders, we are doing something positive to impact on the environment to mitigate that some of our plastics that we produce, may be polluting, but we're going to encourage people to pick up those plastics and do something about it. And this is becoming an increasing topic. And probably the second thing that people ask when it's coming to invest their money, okay, how much are you going to make? How are you going to make it? What are your ESG credentials? The environmental, social, corporate governance. What are you doing about your suppliers and for your staff to make sure your business is sustainable without being harmful to the environment? So that's where I see ESG and loyalty programs and digital remuneration all coming together, and therefore creating a very successful environment, as opposed to perhaps 3 or 4 years ago, you were sort of, ESG wasn't as big a topic. We didn't have the sophistication and the infrastructure that we now have in the digital space. And this whole area has now come together. And I think we're going to see more and more of this coming forward. And you got the big players, as I mentioned earlier, with like JP Morgan, who have come in and said, this is an area that we actually want to try and monetize, and we're going to put hard cash behind it.
I wrote and published a book back in October called Regeneration X, and I talked about Plastic Bank and I talked about ESG, but I did not combine them with reward points. That's a really interesting, take and concept on it.
Yeah, very much so. And there's another company which is it's a startup out of Canada, super interesting. It's called Blood Flow, and what they're doing is incredibly something like about 10 to 15% of people that make an appointment to give blood don't turn up. So you could be talking in the US, there's something like 2.3 million blood donors. So if 10% don't turn up, you could do the maths. 250,000 appointments, 250,000 units of blood. Well, each unit of blood gets sold for around about $200. So they're selling it to pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, and the like. Now, if they could get more people to turn up, they would generate more revenue, which means they could actually advertise and market to actually attract more donors. And therefore, we could go and start solving the problems of a lack of blood and a lack of plasma in the world. So what they're looking at doing is using nudge economics, incentivization, giving some sort of credits. It's all gamification, but you can now do it in a much easier and simpler way. So they're actually looking at creating a system and a process, almost like a software as a service for blood donation agencies, to say, we'll help you make your business more efficient, and we'll help encourage greater engagement with individuals, and we'll give them little tokens and creation. So you can have a situation whereby, and this isn't necessarily the case, but let's just stick with the Canadian theme for a moment. You've got obviously Shopify, it is the biggest company now in Canada by market cap. They may turn around and say, look, we're going to give $25,000 and we're going to give it to our staff as an incentive to go and give blood. So the first 1,000 staff, they get $25 worth of gift vouchers to use on the Shopify site. So bing, tick box, ESG, they can put in their report and accounts. We have donated £25,000 to the Canadian Blood Donation Agency, or whatever it's called. I'm not saying they're doing this. I'm simply giving that as an example. And you could replicate that as an example globally in every jurisdiction. You know, local companies trying to incentivize staff or maybe their customers to give blood. And what better ESG product is there out there than giving blood to your fellow human? The trouble is these blood donation agencies historically have relied on telephones. But, you know, my kids are in their late 20s. Unless they recognize your phone number, they won't pick it up. So you've got to find a different way to reach tomorrow's donors. And so what they're doing with blood flow, as an example, I give a pint of blood or a unit of blood, and then it says, Johnny, your unit of blood was used for a little girl who unfortunately had a car accident, you know, in London, or it was used for an old man that perhaps had a hip operation in Glasgow. So I can then say, oh, wow, I don't need to know the name of the individual, but I can say, great, I can see my unit of blood was used to help save someone's life or help them in their time of need. So again, it's another way of giving transparency, which is what blockchain is so good at, giving that transparency, therefore creating much greater trust, and then an incentive to do more. So that you can see how they're kind of linked in, and that's nothing to do with financial services.
Right. So you mentioned a few things that I found very interesting there. One was health, one was, you know, looking at other countries, and one was blockchain. So if I look at the March 10, 2021 Digital Bytes newsletter, and in particular, you had an article about COVID-19, blockchains offer greater transparency. What role will blockchain play in enabling vaccinated people to conduct commerce and travel within, and, you know, you live in Europe, so within and outside of Europe?
Well, we've got this crazy situation at the moment that, you know, because of Brexit, a lot of the trust is breaking down in terms of trade, you know, and we're not importing what we used to from Europe. Europe's not actually importing a lot of what they used to from the UK because of bureaucracy and a lack of trust in terms of systems. You now stick on top of that a situation whereby you've got a third wave breaking out, and here we are, the 16th of March, breaking out in Italy, and they've been ravaged by COVID. Italy is a major tourist destination. Who's going to want to go to Italy until they've got themselves sorted out? You know, the UK has been hit one of the hardest of all countries in terms of number of deaths. Now, luckily, we're in a situation where the UK government took a bit of a risk and they started ordering vaccinations, and turned out those vaccinations are good and they work. And now we've got a situation whereby in the UK, around about 45% of the adult population is vaccinated. So if you're sitting there and you're somewhere like Spain or Greece or Italy or France, which are major destinations for holidaymakers, are you going to say you want to have Italians in your country who at the moment are going through a third wave and had relatively few people vaccinated? Or do you want you know, someone from another country that can hold up an identification and say, I've been vaccinated, and therefore I'm safe to come into your country? And so there's a lot of anti identification that's going on at the moment. Why should you know anything about me? My identity is sacrosanct. Well, that's very much a UK thing. Most countries in the world have a form of ID, and therefore using it and saying, all you need to know is, my name is Jonny Fry. Here's my biometric information, either for a fingerprint or an iris print or some other way to prove me. And fortunately, I've had one vaccination, and by, you know, June, I'll have had both vaccinations. So by the end of June, in theory, I should be much safer to come into your country than someone that hasn't. And, you know, if you travel to many parts of Africa, you're not allowed into the country unless you can prove you've had a vaccination against yellow fever. Now, I'm a guy in his mid-50s, and I can remember traveling around the world, and I had a vaccination card, and there was hepatitis, and there was yellow fever, and there was tuberculosis, you had to prove that you'd had the necessary vaccinations and boosters and immunization. Now, all that has sort of gone away, but I think that it is very much going to come back. And we've seen the International Chamber of Commerce team up with SOS International, and they're actually working on a program where essentially you'll just show a QR code and you'll be able to prove, have you been tested negative or positive in the last, say, 72 hours? And it'll be very easy then to say, have you been vaccinated? And that's, it's called AOK Pass, this app, and it's out there at the moment. And the Catalan Blockchain Association, they've been working very closely with the city of Girona, and they're actually enabling that city to get back onto its feet and say, we're only going to allow people into football stadiums, into the theatre, into restaurants that can prove that they're not going to infect fellow diners, fellow football fans. And I appreciate that creates a degree of exclusivity, but by doing nothing and saying, oh, well, no, we just hope that it'll be okay. Unfortunately, that hope proves to be fairly shallow, as we're seeing with the second and third wave of this terrible, terrible pandemic sweeping many, many countries.
It's interesting because back in 2004, I backpacked across Southeast Asia and China and wherever, and it was like 7 countries and 9 countries. And I had to show that yellow card wherever I went. So it's interesting that you brought that up.
Yeah.
In the same article, you had a quote by Anna Buteshi, associate professor of law at the University of Exeter, who said the introduction of vaccine passports poses an essential questions for the protection of data privacy and human rights. From the perspective of ethics and personal freedom, how will the use of blockchain technology improve equitable opportunities for regular citizens after these waves are done and we're living in a post-COVID world?
Well, one of the great things about blockchain technology is that you can basically mask some of the information. So what I mean by that is that you can actually hash the details. So for the sort of people that aren't necessarily familiar with that, what we actually have is an ability whereby you can actually say, okay, this is Jonny Fry, or no, this is a white Caucasian who lives in the UK or lives in Europe, and he drives this sort of car. He spends this sort of money on these sorts of sites. You don't need to know my name. You don't need to know my address. You probably want to know the sort of things, the publications that I read. You probably like an indication of my age, my sex, my ethnicity. So you can have a general picture of this person, Jonny Fry, but you don't need to have my personal details. And that's possible by effectively hashing the information. So you can get non-personalized information, but information which could be really valuable for a marketing company. Say, look, you really ought to be putting an advert. If you want to get hold of someone like Jonny Fry, you want to be advertising at the forthcoming World Cup rugby in France in 2030, or he really loves basketball, or he's really into Formula 1 motor racing or NASCAR racing. And these are the places. So if you're after that sort of person, that's where you need to put your marketing spend. But you don't, if you try and get hold of my email address and start cold calling me and sending me emails and things like that, I'm probably not going to respond in any case, and that would actually be illegal now. So blockchain has the ability to take data and keep it very, very secure. It's using military grade cryptography. So the information can be held very, very securely, and then it can be shared on a permission basis. So I can agree to share my information who I want with. So if we take, for example, in the HR field, you've now got applications whereby I'm coming for a job with you, Jamil, and I can say, okay, here's my CV, and I can give you my CV in a digital format. And when I've got a job elsewhere, I can withdraw my permission from you, so you can no longer have access to my details and my information. So again, it's going back to what I said before when we were talking about loyalty schemes and nudge economics. It's empowering the individual. I can share with who, when, and how I like my information. And so I think that we do in the UK, we are wrapped up with this whole thing of privacy and saying, well, we've got to, it's wrong that you have a form of identification. You need to be able to remain independent and anonymous. And at one level, I do have sympathy with that. But at another level, you can't deny that the more authoritarian structure that we've seen in China they managed to jump on top of COVID-19, lock it down by saying, you are not allowed out of your house. You've got to stay there. And it's interesting, if you go back to, where does the word quarantine come from? And it comes back from the Middle Ages, when we actually saw the bubonic plague, the Black Plague, coming down from Northern Europe and sweeping through Germany and France. And the Florentines, they actually posted out guards around the city of Florence and said, you're not allowed into Florence unless you've got some form of health identification. Yes, back in the sort of 1390s, they had that sort of information. You had to have that information. And when you were allowed in, you then had to quarantine, 40 days and 40 nights, stay in the building. Now, Florence had a mortality rate of something like 16%. Milan, who didn't bother, their mortality rate was 60%. So we have this conundrum of individual freedom and, if you like, bureaucratic and autocratic control, and you being structured what you can and cannot do. But I have to be honest, my daughter, who lives in Sydney, I wasn't able to see her this Christmas. I want to go and see her next Christmas. Do I really want to get on a plane for the best part of, 30 hours and be concerned that someone next to me, behind me, or in front of me is coughing away, and maybe it's just something stuck in his throat, or maybe they've actually got COVID? So I'd like the airlines to actually ensure that the people on that plane haven't got COVID, ideally have been vaccinated, and therefore it's a lower risk. Alternatively, I get on a plane, they haven't checked, I die. What does my employer, do my estate then sue the airline, saying you didn't take reasonable care to protect people on your plane? And I think these are some of the challenges we haven't got answers to, but we're going to have to start addressing. But blockchain can play a very vital role, because it's a solution, not bits of paper that can be forged, but a digital way, where you can actually say with a QR code, it gets scanned. Yes, the owner of that QR code actually has been vaccinated or has been tested negative in the last 72 hours, therefore should, in theory, be safe.
Interesting. Very interesting. I want to shift to another article, but you said on board, talk about planes and being on board. One of the other articles talk about being on board is State Street finally sails into the land of crypto. It discussed that, State Street will offer administrative services. And we knew that banks across the world, we knew they would get on board in just a matter of time, right? And it's a matter of time that Wall Street got on board. But when like you and I, who want to travel around the world, or, who are work like me, Main Street, most people working on Main Street, not Wall Street or banks, how would they come on board for crypto and blockchain?
Well, okay, so we put a very small post out on LinkedIn, and within 4 days, and it basically said, as you referred to there, State Street sail into the land of crypto. And the reason we use the word sail was because, for those who are familiar with State Street, part of their logo is a picture of an old sailing ship on the high seas, and so it was a little bit tongue in cheek. But we actually had 33,000 people in 4 business days look at that particular article. Now, we thought that was quite a lot. And then when we started analyzing and looking at who had looked at it, just reading from the top, you got Ernst & Young, HSBC, Citi, PwC, JP Morgan, Deloitte, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley. Wall Street is paying attention. And this is, from New York, London, Toronto, Mumbai, Chicago, Bengaluru in India, San Francisco, New Delhi in India, Boston. And so we're seeing, actually, on a global basis, people are paying attention. Now, we've seen with financial services companies, and I would argue now it's almost a matter of who isn't engaged with blockchain or digital assets in the financial services sector. But to answer your question in terms of how do the men and women on Main Street get involved? Well, I'd argue that they already are to a great extent. And I would give as an example of that, Goldman Sachs did a survey of their clients, and they actually found that 40% of their clients already had exposure to cryptocurrencies, and 64% intended to increase it. We have companies like Apple Pay, Samsung Pay, PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, all these companies now, you can actually put your crypto onto your debit card and you can spend at any one of the outlets that take those different places. And I mentioned earlier on, the likes of PayPal, which is, 3 times the market capitalization of someone like Goldman Sachs or IBM. And these payment methods, these payment platforms, which have very much embraced digital assets now, they're actually much, much bigger than many of the banks that more people are familiar with. And I think what we're seeing is a gentle encouragement behind the scenes of governments for these payment platforms to be ready for central bank digital currencies. Now, we've already seen one in China, and I believe that within the next 18 months, we will see one either in the US, UK, or in Europe. And the reason for this is that interest rates are obviously very, very low, and they're getting to a situation whereby even for smaller men and lady on the high street, they will put £100, $100, 100 yen, 100 euros into their bank account. And this time next year, they might only get back 99 cents, pence, euros. So they're going to see negative interest rates. And governments have historically controlled their economy. When they want to slow it down, they've put interest rates up. When they want to give it a boost, they've cut interest rates. They can no longer cut interest rates. They're already zero in many, many places. And so therefore, how do you encourage people to spend? Well, what you do, you resort to helicopter economics, which is what we've seen with the Biden administration, where they're giving a $1,400 per person and spending $2 trillion. But the trouble is, we've already seen what's happened once. According to the Bank of America, Americans are now sitting on something like $1.6 trillion worth of cash, which they're going to spend. Because anyone that has been working or not financially impaired by COVID over the last year, they haven't been able to go on holiday. They haven't actually been going out. Americans love eating out. They haven't been going out as much as they have done. Haven't been going to the theatre and cinema and things like that. And they've just been accumulating cash. So many, many citizens, certainly in the Western world, if they've had a job, they've just piled up loads and loads of cash. So why is Biden in his administration giving people who've already got loads of cash more cash? If they had a digital currency, they would be able to target that cash and say, anyone that has less than $5,000 in their bank account, bang, we'll give them some money. And what we're seeing is money with restrictions or with conditions. So what's happened in China, in order to start getting their digital currency being used, they've said, we're going to give you, and they've done this 4 or 5 times now, we're going to give you the equivalent of, I think it's $30. And you've got to use that money within 10 days. And you can only use it in the following merchants, the following outlets. So they're actually restricting where you can use it and how you can use it. So in Digital Bytes a couple of weeks ago, we had a gentleman actually write an article, Dr. Stephen Castell, and what he's trying to encourage the UK government to do is to create a digital currency that can only be spent on social housing. So the Bank of England would issue this coin and give it to you on the basis you can only use it if it's to build or if it's to rent or to renovate social property. So very, very targeted money. And so what we see with digital currencies, it gives a whole new tool to central banks to be able to control their economy. And if we suddenly find inflation creeping back into the economy because there's so much money flooding around, well, all they've got to do is actually then start a little bit like Ethereum. They'll just put a transaction fee in there. So that'll dissuade you from spending your money and slow down the pace of money because, instead of going and buying a coffee for, say, $3, it's actually going to cost you $3 plus a transaction fee, which pushes up to $3.50. So it might make you stop. So it gives them much better control. It also gives them much, much better control over the shadow economy, which is prevalent in many, many countries across the world. So they've got a much better idea of what's being spent by who, by when. Now, again, we're going back to this more authoritarian style of sort of governance. But I think what this is going to lead to, though, is we're going to see more corporate companies also issuing their own digital payments. We've seen Facebook try and so far fail, but my belief is that what we're going to see is corporates issuing their own stable coins, their own digital currencies, because it's much, much cheaper to move money around their own ecosystems. And these are global corporations. They're bigger than some countries, and they're able to move money around much more effectively. And all this is doing is history repeating itself, because if you go back to 1863, you saw the Fed was created because at that time there were 8,000 different types of dollars. And the Fed said, well, this has got out of control. We don't know which one's wrong, which one's right, which one's a fake, which one's a forgery. And they said, no, there's only one US dollar backed by the Fed. But perversely, I wouldn't be surprised if we see, multinational corporations like Tencent, Alibaba in China, or you may see, Apple, or you may see, Google actually come out with and say, okay, we'll pay you, we'll reward you in a coin, and you can trust us because actually we've got real assets. We're not in debt up to our neck like the governments are. So it's a huge dilemma here for the governments that they've got to try and keep control over their economy, got to keep control over their currency. But if they're not careful, it's going to be taken away from them, which is why I think you're going to see many, many more central bank digital currencies, which, to answer the question a very long way, I think for coming to Main Street, it's not that far away.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see the multinationals offering something, digital currency. I expect that too. Well, thank you very much today. It's been fascinating conversation. I'm honored that you were on the podcast today. Hopefully I can have you again on the soon as a guest. Thank you. How can our listeners learn more about you or contact you?
The best bet, look up Jonny Fry, Jonny Fry on LinkedIn, and then there's emails and phone numbers and all sorts of details. And if anyone's interested, they can contact Irish Tech News, contact yourself, or contact me through LinkedIn, and we'll send them a copy of the latest Digital Bytes. And in Digital Bytes every week, the sort of subjects that we've talked about this afternoon, that's what we address. We're looking at some of these topics and showing examples with case studies of some of the implications. This week we're looking at non-fungible tokens, and we pose the question, a Pandora's box of goodies to play with, or is it a pot of gold for litigators?
Right. NFTs are definitely a hot topic. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.